that will inform your reporting. So it's really important they have the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, the ESRS, which are a lot of standards that tell you all the areas with all the disclosure requirements and data points that you, more than 1,000 data points that you could be reporting on, but no one wants to do that, all of that, if it's not relevant. So it's about working out under the ESRS, what is actually relevant, what do I have to report on? And to get there, you do that double materiality assessment. So if you're in the European Union and you're affected by CSRD, you will have to do a double materiality assessment. And within the ESRS, it's also important that there are requirements around that. So there is a whole set of things that you'll have to do. There's some areas where there's a bit more flexibility or a bit more scope to work out how you do certain things, but there are definitely some requirements there about certain things that you have to do that need to be part of that double materiality assessment. And the other part to keep in mind is that this will be assured. So there is assurance around that. So they are going to look at not just your final reporting, your disclosures, but also part of that is actually how have you done that double materiality assessment. There are quite a few disclosures in ESRS 2 that actually get into how have you done your double materiality assessment? Have you ticked all these boxes? It's process documentation. So it's like back in school when the math teacher says, great, you know the answer, but can you also tell me how you got there? That's what CSRD is trying to do as well. You need to work out what's important, but also show how you got there. So that's if you fall under CSRD in European Union. Now, there are definitely more initiatives that to be aware of, and there are two kind of main international voluntary standards. So we have the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, and GRI, that's voluntary reporting. If you as a company anywhere in the world want to report on the GRI, then that requires you to do an impact materiality assessment. And GRI in their GRI 3 standard outlines what the requirements are. There are 3 steps or 4 steps really to do that work. They give you some guidelines, some things you could be doing or should be doing. It's less strict in a sense than CSRD, but it has definitely some steps and some things you need to work through. And again, very strong on process documentation and engagement with stakeholders. So not I'll sit at my desk and do the exercise and then we're done. Now you need to actually talk to people, internal and external. So that's GRI. So GRI impact materiality. Then at the bottom there, where the image should be, that is IFRS. And IFRS is kind of absorbed some of the former standards, so like TCFD and SASB, and they are focused on financial materiality. So that means they want to have you look at the risks and opportunities. So that's really the same type of thing. You want to go through that. They have a standard S1, which is saying, look at what is material to you from a risk and opportunity perspective and report on those topics. So we see companies around the world either do GRI, impact materiality, or IFRS. We see them do that for financial materiality. We see some companies say, we do want to do double materiality, so we'll use both GRI and IFRS, which is a really good approach. But then also, and that's really important, is that IFRS standard is a voluntary standard, but we do see a lot of jurisdictions around the world are actually taking those standards and saying, we're now implementing this nationally and mandating that. So these voluntary standards from IFRS are becoming legislative requirements in countries. So we've seen that now, for instance, in Australia, that they've taken those IFRS standards, implemented them and said for the S1, the materiality kind of broad-based materiality standard, they said for now that's voluntary. So in Australia, under their materiality standard, you don't have to do that. But there's also a climate standard, and that also requires you to look at climate specific. So just for climate, risks and opportunities. So financial materiality assessment, but only on climate. And that comes originally out of TCFD. So the short of it is really make sure that you look at where do you have operations, where do you have compliance and reporting requirements, and look at is any of that, does that require you to do a materiality assessment? And what type of materiality assessment should that be? Should it be financial or impact or double? And are there particular requirements? Or is it really more like thematic or focused? Should it just be on climate or on nature or on human rights? There's all different standards and requirements. So with a materiality assessment, we always say that when a company wants to do that, first look at this. Start to work out what you have to do, start to work out what you want to do, and see if you can match that, and then kind of work your way through what are the steps required to actually do that assessment.
hopefully what you have to do and what you want to do isn't too far apart.
Hopefully,
Like,
yes, yes.
it's the closer the better. But
Yeah.
that's really useful. In terms of like how prescriptive this guidance is, particularly from like a timing perspective. Like I think back to, so just linking it back to like accounting in terms of what I know. So you're going to do, obviously you've got your annual reporting, which is much more detailed, but then you've got your quarterly reporting as well. And there's definitely a materiality lens that gets cast over those quarterly reports. Is there anything prescriptive in this guidance, particularly say the CSRD, that is maybe a little more prescriptive and obviously mandatory, or is it a bit more sort of a best practice lens, or is it a bit of both in terms
So
of timing?
yeah, so if we look at CSRD, they're very clear on timing. You need to do a double materiality assessment every year. There's a little bit of flexibility around what that exactly entails. So we see companies do in year one a real deep dive where they're the first time to really adhere and be compliant with CSRD requirements, try to do it really well. And then maybe in a subsequent year, they say, well, we've just done all that work. This is still pretty fresh. We have to do that double materiality assessment. We're going to do some kind of a little bit more high level validation. So we are going to look at those impact risk opportunities, but we already identified them last year. So we're going to cast our eyes over it, see if anything has changed. That is a key question. If nothing structurally has changed, no mergers, no major changes in your value chain, then it's a little bit easier to just validate what you did. It's still really important to look at that and explain what you've done. So transparency, comes at number one. Explain what you did so your stakeholders and insurers can see what you did in terms of your double materiality assessment. And there's timing. So it needs to be part of your full CSRD reporting suite. So all the disclosures there, this is part of that. So you need to make sure that you take sufficient time, you have a good kind of runway to do all the work. Deep materiality assessment often is one of the first pieces because it informs a lot of the disclosures and work that comes after that. So you don't want to, at the end of, getting close to the end of the reporting, starting to think about a materiality assessment because you simply will be too late then. In terms of other jurisdictions or requirement, every standard or jurisdiction will have its own requirements around that. So it's really important to read through what are the things we need to do, how do we need to display this, will it be assured or not? There are different requirements around that, and that's really important to understand that at the start. So you really go, open eyes into the exercise, understand how much time and effort it is to do the work. And one of the other things that I think is really kind of relevant around this as well is that we see more and more companies starting to realize that sustainability reporting is not a one-off thing. It's not like we've done our report once, we tick it, and we never have to do it again. It is to a point, it's like financial reporting. Sustainability is just non-financial reporting. And every year and every quarter, you're looking at how is my budget tracking? What is the budget for the next year? What do I need to report financially? Sustainability and non-financial information is the same. And we see that companies are quite kind of in tune with more traditional corporate, enterprise risk management. And if you ask them about that, they're like, yeah, we have our enterprise risk management system, our risk register. We check that every quarter or sometimes even every month. We check if they're new risk, if they've escalated. We need to prioritize them up and down, what's going on. And that informs, some of our financial reporting, how we engage with our investors and other stakeholders. So it informs a lot. What I'm realizing now is that this is very similar in a sense. Managing your sustainability related impacts, risks, and opportunities should not be a, first month of the year exercise where you do the work and then say the next 11 months we're good and then we'll come back to it. It should be this ongoing project, ongoing management. So it is really more of a ongoing pace marathon than a sprint that you do at the start of the year. Yeah, we got it locked in. We don't worry about it anymore. And we see companies are starting to think about that at the same time as they're starting to think about sustainability as an embedded function. It's not a kind of, bolted on function where we have a team and they do a little bit of work and that's it. Everyone in the business needs to think about this. Similarly, with financial reporting, every department will have their departmental budget and they need to track, do I still have money to do this or not? With sustainability, the same. You need to start training not one massive sustainability team. You can get away these days with a smaller sustainability team as long as you have every other team starting to kind of internalize and embed sustainability thinking in what they do. And that might mean investor relations. When they talk to investors, ask them 1 or 2 questions when you talk to them anyways that are relevant to inform your materiality assessment. And that's when you want to think about, how do we take all this work on an ongoing basis and get our existing communication channels, day-to-day business, to take that sustainability lens, so that this materiality assessment becomes an ongoing exercise, and it's not this kind of burden of a sprint every year.
Yeah, and we see that as well in carbon accounting, where trying to integrate a lot more of what finance is doing, but then as well in the reporting assessments, to your point, with things like a sustainability risk, to say you'd be surprised how much other teams within the business are already holding a lot of this information, often without even realizing. I mean, if you can directly engage these teams to be a part of that sustainability reporting journey, even the better. But even without that, there is a lot that they're doing already that you could be leaning on. I think a lot of sustainability professionals we speak to are quite surprised just how much information finance has, just how much information procurement has in the buying teams. But then also from, recent.
Dropping out for me, Henry. I don't know if you're still there. See if you come back. In the meantime, I see that Larry had a question there about if there are any businesses that adopt CSRD that have a comprehensive double materiality assessment published already that we can learn from. That is a really good question. And we've seen the first companies already start reporting on CSRD. And there's a lot of reports on, last count, I think there were between 60, 70 reports out there, varying degrees of quality.
Apologies.
I was just answering the question in the chat about the CSRD reports that are already out there. There are definitely a lot of CSRD reports out there that I've looked at that we can learn a lot from. In terms of double materiality assessment, we've gone through them. There's definitely some areas that really stand out. And one of them that I think is really interesting is that CSRD does require you to engage with stakeholders. And in particular, they say engage with affected stakeholders. And what that means is the people or groups or stakeholders that you actually are having an impact on. So it's really about that impact materiality. Who are you having in particular, negative impact on? It's really important. So from that perspective, that's in the standards. You need to do that and address that. But there's quite a few double materiality assessments that we've seen in CSRD reporting that are either not doing stakeholder engagement at all, very limited, or unclear. So I think stakeholder engagement is still a gap in that sense, that companies are trying to struggle and figure out how can they be done in an efficient way. How do we integrate that? It's a lot easier just to grab the management team, sit around the table, and just work it out yourself. You could argue, if you have 5 in the management team, those are internal stakeholders. But there will definitely be some external impacts as well on people. And you want to understand, if you as a management team think, well, they're pretty moderate potential impacts. But if you then talk to a particular community and no, these are real impacts, and this is really affecting my quality of life, or, treading on my human rights, that is really important to know. And that's what CSRD trying to get out there. So that's just one area. There are definitely some good reports out there. And I would encourage you to just kind of look at those reports that are already out there to just see how companies are addressing that. And there's a wide variety in how they do that. But there's some really interesting things that we see. And I think over the next few years, we'll see consolidation to the best ways of doing that. But it's still early days.
Appreciate that. Yeah, and that's so similar in financial reporting as well, where something comes up. I mean, any standard, but even linking back to materiality, a lot of this is leaned off best practice, sort of looking at what peers are doing, look at what's gone through an audit, particularly for a large public company, and said, okay, this is what they did. Let's leverage that, and that's obviously going to be refined over time. Auditors are very, very good at picking holes in what was done in the prior year. So year on year, this is going to be refined. It's going to get better and better and better, just as the auditors are learning how to audit this, companies will then be tested more on their methodologies, and then that'll only be refined from there. So just leaning back on something we've seen play out over the years already as well. So I guess with that, and I'm bringing up a few here as well, but like, what are the biggest challenges that companies face when it comes to materiality assessment? So we've got a few here to sort of maybe spur some thoughts that Tim and I had thought of, but I guess putting this in sort of a more verbal format, like when obviously you're working with companies all the time who are often doing this for the first time, often, either sort of mid-sized companies, sometimes large companies, small companies, whatever size it may be, and they're sort of big common challenges that most of them face when it comes to getting started with this, or perhaps not even getting started. Perhaps this is just an ongoing challenge.
Yeah. There are a lot of challenges we've identified, and I'm going to start at the bottom right there with superficial process. And what we mean with that is maybe not superficial per se, but not clarity on actually what needs to happen or what you're actually trying to do. So this goes back to the start of our conversation today about the different approaches to materiality, financial impact, double, or really kind of specialized on a particular more topic-based. The different ways of doing things and different reasons why you would be doing that. And what we see is some companies, have not listened to this webinar. They have no idea really what materiality is, but they've heard or believe that it is important, but they don't really know what they want to do. So they just get started in a way, but they don't really have clear guidance on what they're trying to do there. Or sometimes they're trying to do a few things at the same time and they don't know how to integrate that. Or with that, they end up with a process that's not clear, that's quite superficial, and it's not setting them up for success for that matter. With that, then, when you don't really know what you're doing per se, we often see that, or even when you do know what you're doing, we see that difficulty engaging stakeholders, which we just flagged as well, is really a key area where we really see a lot of companies, but also consultants that help companies do this work, say it is difficult to do that stakeholder engagement and do that well. And how do you do that in a good way that is efficient, that is quality, and that actually gives you deep and rich insights, because that's in the end what you're looking for. You're not looking per se to just tick the box and tell CSRD or your standard that did stakeholder engagement. It should also actually give you some value and give you some insights. And that's to another point where we see sometimes that people say, well, this materiality assessment, which is nothing new that we discovered. And when you dig a bit deeper then with them, like what have you done and how have you done that, you see it was a pretty unclear and superficial process. They didn't really know how to engage stakeholders. They sent a bit of a shotgun approach survey to 200 people and hoped something came out of it, quantity over quality, and then nothing new came out of it. And then they said, it was such a heavy burden on the team because we had to do all this work and we weren't sure what we were doing. So we already see some of these things. There's a lot of dependencies and a lot of kind of interactions between some of these common challenges there. So in terms of engaging stakeholders, really important to think that through. How do we want to engage them? Can we do a few one-on-one interviews, focus groups, workshops, surveys? People kind of love and hate surveys. Now, if you get a survey, you have to answer it. Most people don't really want to do that. But at the same time, it is a good tool. If you send it out, you hope to get some insights and you instrument the survey in the right way. So you really kind of get people to hopefully complete that survey for you. You definitely can collect some quality information. So by using those different engagement strategies, you can definitely get some really good insights on what is important to the people that you affect. But equally, you can go out to your investors, shareholders, employees and ask, what are the risks and opportunities you see for our business? And how severe are they? And what's the likelihood or magnitude of them? So that's what you're trying to work out there. Now, another problem that both consultants and companies have is that all of this is generally done in our trusted spreadsheets. So yes, you can do everything and anything in spreadsheets, but it can be quite a process. And in particular, if you're running a double materiality assessment or you're running a CSRD double materiality assessment, it can be a lot of work. And if you start with a blank spreadsheet, setting that all up in the first place is a lot of work. But equally managing stakeholder engagement in there and just making sure it all works. If you get a good consultant who's done this many times, they may have built a very complex spreadsheet that does a lot for you and is all linked and formulas. And if it doesn't break, it might be really useful. But at the same time, there's a lot of people that are trying to get out of the spreadsheets and have really a dedicated place to do this on an ongoing basis. So that goes back to the point, if you have work with a consultant for 3 months and they do it in a spreadsheet, then yeah, that might be project based. But it is a lot easier if you have a materiality management platform where you can do this work on an ongoing basis. Your team, your embedded sustainability people in various departments can log in. I just had a conversation with an investor that flagged something really interesting. Going to make a note of that in the system. And over the months and the quarters, you're collecting all this information without doing any additional effort or very minimal effort. The sustainability team can see all the data points you're collecting. So that's really important there. And in doing that, you definitely are going to collect some new interesting things, better and deeper insights. And in doing that as well, it will be not so much of a heavy burden on teams, because that sprint attitude almost is really something where we see a lot of companies say, even the large companies, they want to do this exercise, they want to do it well, but they're struggling with all these things here. It's a last minute sprint. It's a heavy burden on the team. And then what you get to in the end is that it becomes something that was such an effort. I don't want to do it again next year. And if you're operating in a, not per se mandated space where you do this as a voluntary exercise to inform your reporting, companies choose to not do it every year. Maybe they do it every 2 or 3 or 4, and now even companies do it every 5 years, because it was such a hard exercise on the team. And I think that's all about how you frame the exercise and all those problems we talk about, that if you manage them and mitigate them, then suddenly you can get into more of a cadence there. It's paced and it's not so hard every year to do that. So I think we touched upon a lot of these points here, but I'll also be interested if there are any questions from anyone on the call here about, common problems or challenges you might have experienced or that you're worried about. So if you do have them, definitely put them in the question and answer, because we see a lot of people struggling with materiality assessments.
While we wait on people to add some questions in, I have one which hopefully is on other people's minds, or maybe it's just me. Say, obviously, there's a lot to do when it comes to a materiality assessment, depending on the size of your business, but there's quite a bit that can go into that. What, say, a company's never done this before, and they're just thinking, how do I get started with this? Like, what's the most impactful thing I could do from an assessment perspective right now? What would you say would just be step one from your perspective, beyond obviously calling Socialsuite? what could be the most impactful thing that they could do if they were going to start somewhere?
I think the most impactful theme is the very first thing. If you believe materiality is something you might want to do, is educate yourself. So that goes back to the point, what do you have to do and what do you potentially do more on a voluntary basis? What are those requirements between those two areas there? Are you doing already GRI reporting, and to what degree do you do with reference or in accordance with, which are different ways? How do you do that materiality assessment right now? Do you want to add to that, say, financial materiality with IFRS, or are you suddenly on a pathway that you have to do CSRD? So educate yourself on what materiality is, but not just yourself, but the team as well. And trying to work out that if you're the sustainability lead in the business and you believe this is important and you get your head around this, or you already have that, make sure that you have support and champions within the business as well. So at management level, sometimes at board level, that depends a little bit, but that you get people to also understand this and see the value. And maybe to that point is really important that what materiality will enable you to do is really 3 things. We already spoke about it gives you clarity what to report on. So that's, in my mind, kind of the third pillar there. It tells you these topics are important. We should be disclosing information on this because this is material. But even before that, the very first thing it will actually tell you is, from a strategic perspective, within the sustainability space, how do we instrument our sustainability strategy? What is really important that we, in the next few years, focus our efforts on, because we know that that is material. So strategically, it can really feed into strategy refresh. That might be a sustainability or ESG strategy, or sometimes even corporate refresh, corporate strategy, that you feed the sustainability elements in there. And that depends on like really what are the material areas that you're focusing on. Some companies, climate might be less important, whereas for other companies in certain sectors and industries, climate is their number one priority in terms of the emissions they have. Then you really need to put strategies in place. Whereas other companies might say, well, for me, it's more, responsible products because we're affecting, the health and well-being of people. That is really the main kind of area we should be focusing on. And that's strategically where we want to, put programs in place. Now that brings us then to the second pillar, and that is what people often forget is a strategy they get, the reporting they get, but there's a bit in the middle there, and that is what are you doing on a day-to-day basis, your operations. So that is practice or sustainability practice, the doing of sustainability, the operations. Often that is linked then to this is an excellent kind of, really good slide to look at. So strategy tells you roughly the key areas to focus on, and practice then is actually what are you going to do about it then? If you have 3 strategic focus areas for sustainability for the next, say, 3 years, what are you going to do next year on those areas? And how are you going to implement that and make sure that if gender equality is really important to you, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to implement that? And then ultimately, reporting is all about how did you perform in that area and in some of those other areas that are important to you. So then you might be saying, this was our strategy in terms of reporting. This is what we've done. And here are some metrics and disclosures around gender equality in terms of actually what we have delivered. We've gone from a certain percentage to another. We've improved a bit, and that is due to our programs and our strategic focus on that area. And we are focusing on that because the materiality assessment clearly indicated that our stakeholders see that as one of the key priorities for our business. So that's really kind of good way to think about it. So this is one of the first things. If your company can get their head around this, that a materiality assessment can actually create value strategically, operationally in practice and reporting, it sets up a lot there. So if you can educate and get people on board with this concept, then you go to what is that materiality assessment we're going to do? What are the compliance requirements? And once you know that, you're actually going to instrument the next steps that you can, do the materiality assessment itself.
It's interesting. And I'd say from your experience, how sort of hard or easy is this to verify the work of others? Because I think from a financial standpoint, it's pretty clear cut for the most part. It's sort of whatever sort of percentage has been determined by and there's a bit that goes into it, but essentially it's math. If an account is financially immaterial, then it's immaterial, and that's not something that you necessarily need to report under. There's obviously a bit of work to work out if it's immaterial, which sort of somewhat defeats the purpose, but that you do an assessment and mathematically you determine that. A lot of this is more qualitative, right? Where, there is some numbers obviously around certain elements, but there are also certain elements, like you said, if the work you're doing is impacting animals, which could be seen as more of a qualitative assessment, that you have noticed that is an impact that your business could have. Are there instances where sort of key areas have perhaps been missed because it is just that much harder to measure, and does that get picked up? Or I guess how difficult or confident are a lot of companies around the fact that they've captured everything in the materiality assessment?
Yeah, there's definitely a learning curve around this. And to that point, yes, it can definitely be seen as subjective. We're trying to make it as objective as possible, but that is difficult. With financial reporting, to your point, at some point you say anything that will cost us potentially from a risk perspective more than say $1 million is material. Everything under that is not, and then you just do the numbers and say, yeah, all these risks are under and all these other ones are over. So everything over is material and we're going to report on it. This is slightly different. From a risk perspective and opportunity perspective, you can still try to do the same thing. So financial materiality within sustainability, you can still look at, the risk, the physical impacts of climate change is posing to our assets. We're in low-lying areas there where flood risk is relatively high. We know that now. It's gone from a 1 in 10,000 years to 1 in 100 years. So, that has increased a lot. It's our main asset. So we believe that, the financial risk to that is a certain level. So definitely you can do something around that. So that is what people do. From an impact perspective, it's slightly different. And what we generally try to do is work out what are the impacts that we believe that we have, but really in that engage those stakeholders as well and ask them, we believe we might have this impact. Is that accurate? Can you validate that impact? But also, have we missed an impact? And then is starting to assess and work with your stakeholders on there. What is the severity of that impact? And with severity, we're thinking about the scale, the scope, the irremediability for negative impact. So if this impact, eventuates, then can we remediate that impact? And certainly, like the loss of life, can you ever remediate that? No, you can't bring someone back. So if there's loss of life, that's irremediable. So if you trying to score that on a scale of 1 to 5, you would say that is 5. If the result is loss of life, we can't remediate that. Yes, you could have put measures in place to prevent it again from happening, but we're looking at this particular impact here. So the same with scale and scope, how widespread and how kind of significant is the actual impact you're having. And then there's, of course, the likelihood we're looking at as well. How likely is this impact to actually occur? Or if it's actual already, we don't have to look at that. And based on that, we do some, we talk to stakeholders and what do we know ourselves already? We talk to experts in the space to get a sense of, how that severity is rated. And in particular, there are always, areas that are more important. Human rights is one of those areas. If there are human rights violations or potential violations, that generally already puts a little red flag up, like this is something that we don't want to skip over too much and might actually be, quite quickly material. So yes, it's subjective, and that's why we talk to a lot of people to just get their views on it and really understand if we think that our production process might actually lead to soil pollution in our neighboring communities, then do they actually experience, like we can measure that in the ground, but what do they actually, experience? Have they seen crop failure? Have they seen anything else? And trying to then kind of work that out. And then put some scores around that, and then ultimately look at, on the scale, you get into a process in the end with prioritization as well. Human rights violations, irremediability are really two red flags. And then, what is scored really high compared to areas, other kind of things that are, where the likelihood is not that high, the severity is not that high. Say, well, that probably falls then under the line, which that is your materiality threshold line. So yes, subjectivity comes a little bit in there, but through all that engagement, we're trying to make it as objective and multi kind of perspective as possible.
It's interesting, and Larry's put an interesting question as well in terms of the interplay between that impact and the financial. So his question is, what's also interesting is the perspective of determining whether an event is material or not, and sort of in relation to those two. So say a profit-making company, an event might be material to the community. So they've done something that impacts the community, maybe impacted the soil in some way, as you mentioned. But from maybe a financial perspective, it's not something that's material to them, whether that be any immediate loss or even long-term loss that they've assessed is not going to be financially material to their business. Is it sort of an either or both, or when weighing up those two things from a double materiality perspective, how would you look at those sort of situations?
Now you can't kind of net them out. You can't say I'm having a negative impact there, but I'm doing something good as well, so that's going to net each other out. That's definitely off the record. That you can't do that. That's very clear in the guidance everywhere that you can't kind of do that. The other point then there is around really separating the events there, and if your impact on a community is material to the community, it will be, potentially, it still depends, how they define materiality and how, you score that materiality. And so if they have massive crop failure or there's something else happening that might have a financial impact on them, but not on you, then it's still likely a material issue because you're having a direct impact on that community there. So you really want to make sure that you capture that as a material impact and think about remediation of that, mitigation measures. What can you do about that? But the fact that it doesn't have a financial risk for you or very low financial risk, because what can the community do, for instance? They can't sue us or they can't do anything. That's a separate, there might be a risk. So we see a lot of impacts often have risks and opportunities associated with them, but there might not be material. There might be. So what we see in this exercise, and this is another really good point to make, is that quite early in the process, you want to really understand your full value chain. So what are your operations, all the way from supply chain to your own operations to, your off-takers, downstream, end of life of products. All that in there is where you want to look for impacts, risk, opportunities, but also critical dependencies. What are we dependent on? Natural capital, social capital, and work out for that instance, like, where are those risks and opportunities related and impacts related to dependency. So there's this whole web of kind of relationship between dependencies, impact, risks, and opportunities, but they don't cancel each other out, or they don't kind of, net each other out.
Yeah, so it's sort of like if there's a risk on one side, then there's a risk. It's not a sort of way off of, oh, it's not a risk on the other side. So it's not either, but rather,
Yeah.
if you got one, you got one.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Excellent. So I think that's covered all our questions, and I know we have. I'll give another sort of 10 seconds maybe in case anyone else has a question they want to squeeze in here. But in the meantime, I really appreciate your time, and I know that there's a ton of content on the Socialsuite website as I looked through in preparation for our discussion today. So definitely would recommend anyone who wants to read up more on this topic. You're not the only one here, Larry. We do have some other folk, but I think there are a lot of people in Larry. For anyone who can't see, Larry DeSaspi is the only one here. You are not. I think we do have a lot of people in the US and Australia who are probably just exhausted. So I think that's the main cause here. But definitely feel free to email either Tim or myself if you do have any questions after this as well. And as I was mentioning, the Socialsuite website has a ton of content specific to double materiality as well. And I know that we talk quite frequently, Tim and I, and obviously these are two topics that, in terms of carbon accounting, sustainability reporting, and double materiality and materiality assessments, obviously very, very closely linked. So we definitely look forward to each other's content, and I've read quite a bit of it myself, so I can definitely recommend it. So I will definitely send everyone out the slides I have, but more importantly, the recording of this webinar itself. Feel free to obviously share that. You'll get that as a shareable YouTube link. So if you want to share that to any of your colleagues, obviously more than welcome to do so as well. And I appreciate everyone's time, and thank you so much, Tim, for your time.
Thanks, Henry. It's a pleasure to talk with you about materiality, and questions. Like you said, we have a lot of webinars, recordings, but also upcoming webinars all about materiality. Really, that's our focus area. And we talk a lot directly with companies that are trying to do this, but also with consultants. So we really kind of instrumented our products as well to help consultants make their life a bit easier. So looking forward to talk to people who potentially want to see a demo or better understand that process that we can help them with, run through actually conducting a materiality assessment.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for your time attending, and hope everyone has a good day or night wherever you happen to be, and thank you again, Tim. See you, everyone.